So, my boyfriend Matt, 30, and I, Mike, 25, recently broke up, and honestly, it's been one of the hardest, most gut-wrenching experiences I've ever gone through. The way it all unfolded was so complicated and painful. It's like this whirlwind of emotions that I can barely process. The whole thing started a couple of weeks ago when Matt sent me a Snapchat. It was while he was at work, and it only lasted about 3 seconds. It seemed so random and out of place. At first, I didn't think too much of it, but something in my gut was telling me that something wasn't right. It just didn't feel like him. I couldn't shake the feeling, so I decided to ask him about it. His excuse? He said his phone had overheated or glitched, some technical mumbo-jumbo. At the time, I wanted to trust him, I really did, but deep down, I could tell there was something off about his explanation. It just didn't add up. I wasn't satisfied with his answer, so I started pushing him a little harder. That's when he said, "I swear I'll never lie to you again, Mike. I get it, I really hurt you, and I need to make this right." You'd think hearing that would have meant something, but it didn't. I was already starting to lose trust in him, and that was such a crushing realization. The whole night felt like a slow unraveling of everything we had together. It was like watching a dream fade away in real time. Matt had suggested we grab a bite to eat together, and honestly, I was holding on to that small glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could fix things over a meal. But when he finally came home, we didn't go out like we had planned. Instead, we just went to bed, and out of nowhere, he was all over me. I had no idea how to react. It felt so confusing, but then, he couldn't hold it in anymore. He came clean. He admitted that earlier that same day, while I was in the next room, having a Zoom call with my therapist, he had snapped a picture of his ass and sent it to some guy he'd been into for years. And the worst part? This guy wasn't some random stranger. He was someone Matt had kept a secret from me for so long. Matt swore that he hadn't actually sent the picture, but after everything that had happened, I couldn't bring myself to believe him. It felt like everything was falling apart all at once. We spent hours that night just arguing, crying, and trying to process this huge emotional flood that hit me like a tidal wave. I couldn't understand how we went from being so happy to being in this broken, confusing mess where nothing felt real anymore. The very next day, things didn't get better. Matt drove me to a friend's house for a party, and the whole ride there, he was holding my hand, telling me how much he loved me, how much he missed me, and how I could always message him if I needed a ride home. In that moment, for a split second, I thought maybe things would be okay. Maybe we could fix this. But that wasn't the case. Later that night, I mentioned I was thinking about staying at my friend's place. He didn't seem to mind at all. In fact, he said he was going to stay with his family, which, at the time, seemed totally fine. But then, the next few hours were a blur. He completely ignored my calls and texts. I didn't hear from him at all. When I finally got back home, everything had changed. I walked in to find that he had already packed his bag and taken his laptop with him. It was clear that he had been planning this for a while, maybe even before going to work that morning. I was pretty drunk, definitely not proud of it, but I ended up texting him, telling him how selfish, inconsiderate, and avoidant he was being. When he finally answered the phone, I let him have it. I told him I was coming over to talk things through, which I know now wasn't the smartest thing to do. But in the heat of the moment, it felt like the only thing that made sense. When I showed up at his place, he was so dismissive. Later, I found out that his sister had been sitting right there next to him, recording everything and advising him on what to say. It felt like he was staging everything, making it all about how I was reacting, and that hurt even more. I was so angry and confused. It felt like he was just playing some sick game, and I was the pawn. In an attempt to calm myself down, I ordered some food, hoping it would help me sober up. But in the chaos of everything, I ended up forgetting my keys. I kept calling him, hoping he'd come let me in. But no. He turned off his phone and ignored every single one of my calls. That night, I ended up sitting on the cold pavement from around 3 a.m. until almost 8 a.m. I was freezing, and I kept waiting for his family to bring over his set of keys so I could get inside. But more than that, it hurt to realize that, in that moment, I felt completely alone in this relationship. The cold wasn't even the worst part. It was the fact that I had no one to turn to. After that night, he kept giving me the runaround. One minute, he'd tell me he'd come back home, and the next, he'd backtrack. Eventually, he told me he'd come back after Christmas, and I just couldn't take it anymore. That's when I broke up with him. Every time we talked about what had happened, he would completely shift the focus onto my reaction and never once take responsibility for his actions. It was like he was deflecting all the blame onto me, and I couldn't keep doing it. I was exhausted. I was done. But what really crushed me was the realization that this wasn't the first time he'd lied to me. It wasn't even the second time. Early on in our relationship, about 4 months in, I had to ask him to unfollow his ex's alternate Twitter account and stop sending nudes. Then, he lied about his ex reaching out to him and about an item he'd bought for me while we were dating. He had given it to his ex, then lied about it for the next 14 months. On top of all of that, he never fully deleted his dating profiles. He just deleted the apps, but the profiles were still active. And we had several conversations about sex and pornography, each one leaving me more unsettled than the last. One of the lowest moments came at a wedding we attended together. He actually outed me as trans to his friends. He called me over, pointed out the scar cream I was using, and made a show of it by showing his friend my scars. When I asked for space afterward, both he and his sister kept following me around, making everything worse. I had no privacy. No dignity. Even with everything he did, though, I still found myself blaming myself. I kept thinking, if I hadn't gotten so angry, if I had just taken a walk instead of confronting him right away, maybe things would have turned out differently. Maybe I was asking for too much. I convinced myself that if I cooked for him, cleaned his place, washed all his clothes, and rearranged my life around his gigs, things would improve. But none of it worked. Nothing made a difference. And now, all I have are these thoughts running in circles in my head, asking myself what I could have done differently. For the past week and a half, I've been torturing myself, convinced that the breakdown of our relationship was somehow my fault. All I want is to have him back. Because even though he hurt me so badly, I know he has this side to him that's kind, loving, and sweet. That's the part of him I fell in love with, and I miss it terribly. But everything changed after I lost my job about 6 months ago. The tension between us grew, and we started fighting more. He told me that the stress of dealing with insurance, Centrelink, and everything else had really gotten to him, and that was part of the reason he had started acting out. I didn't understand it at the time, but now I see how it contributed to his behavior. The stress, the pressure, it all built up inside of him until it came pouring out in ways I never expected. A couple of weeks ago, Matt came over, and we slept together. He told me he loved me, that he missed me, and how some of his clothes still smelled like me. He even admitted to jerking off while thinking about us. I didn't know what to make of it. It made me feel wanted, but at the same time, it left me so confused about everything that had happened between us. What was real? What was just him trying to pull me back in? Now I'm just completely lost. I don't know what's real anymore or where I stand. How do I move forward when I'm still so in love with him? I know a lot of his actions come from his unhealed trauma, and that breaks my heart. I understand that he's been carrying so much pain for so long, but it doesn't change the fact that he's hurt me, too. I'm just not sure how to process it all. And then, I found out that he'd been using an app for a toy we bought together to sext other people. I don't know if I was more upset by the fact that he was still looking for intimacy elsewhere, or that he was doing it with something that I thought was supposed to be special between us. Most recently, he told me he was feeling really low, contemplating suicide, and even ended up self-harming. It absolutely shattered me to hear that, but I knew I had to cut all contact with him. I unfriended and unfollowed him everywhere on social media. We had plans to meet for coffee, but when I confronted him about some of his behavior, he came up with this ridiculous excuse about needing to help his parents, with their kitchen renovations. He claimed there were bricks where there weren't supposed to be bricks. But I knew it was just classic avoidance. He was running. Now, I feel absolutely terrible for cutting him off. My heart aches at the thought of never speaking to him again. I'm terrified about what will happen the next time I see him out, and I'm even more terrified that he might hurt himself or worse. I don't want him to leave this world. I just wish things could have turned out differently, that he could have gotten the help he needed before all of this spiraled out of control. Pensive face.